Wherever you are right now, in whatever quiet corner of the world you've found yourself, I want you to pause. Close your eyes if you can, or simply let your gaze soften. Think back to a moment in your childhood when someone read you a story. Perhaps it was your mother, tucking you into bed with the scent of lavender on her skin. Perhaps it was your father, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder as he turned the pages. Or maybe it was a teacher, surrounded by children cross-legged on a carpet worn thin by years of small feet. In that moment, you believed. You believed in glass slippers that fit only 1 foot in all the kingdom. You believed in wolves that spoke with silver tongues. You believed in spindles that could steal away 100 years in the prick of a finger. But here is what you did not know, what no one told you then, what perhaps even they did not fully understand. Those stories were not merely entertainment. They were not simple tales to help you drift into sleep. They were vessels, carefully crafted over centuries, carrying messages that were too dangerous, too complex, too profound to speak aloud in the harsh light of day. Tonight, we are going to uncover something that has been hiding in plain sight for generations. We're going to discover that the fairy tales you thought you knew, the ones that shaped your earliest understanding of the world, contain layers upon layers of meaning that most people never glimpse. We're going to trace the blood-red thread that connects ancient mythology to medieval folklore, from oral traditions whispered around hearth fires to the sanitized versions printed in children's books today. And as we journey together through enchanted forests and crumbling castles, past wicked stepmothers and cunning wolves, you will begin to see patterns emerging. Patterns that speak to the deepest parts of the human experience. Patterns that reveal truths about transformation, about sexuality, about power, about survival, about the very nature of consciousness itself. This is not going to be a quick journey. We will not rush through these revelations. Instead, we're going to move slowly, carefully, the way one might walk through a forest at twilight, when the familiar becomes strange and every shadow holds a secret. We will explore the stories you think you know and discover that you have never really known them at all. Because fairy tales, my friend, are far more than they appear. They are maps to the human soul, encoded in symbol and metaphor. They are survival manuals disguised as children's entertainment. They are initiations into adulthood wrapped in the language of magic, and they have been speaking to us all along, if only we knew how to listen. Let us begin at the beginning. Though even that phrase is deceptive when we speak of fairy tales, for there is no single beginning to these stories. They are ancient as the hills, older than written language, born from the primal need of human beings to make sense of a world that often seemed senseless. Long before the Brothers Grimm put pen to paper in early 19th century Germany, these tales existed as oral traditions, passed from grandmother to grandchild, from travelling merchant to village innkeeper, from one generation to the next like precious heirlooms worn smooth by the handling of countless hands. They crossed borders and oceans, adapting to new landscapes and new cultures, absorbing local customs and regional fears, yet somehow retaining their essential core, that kernel of truth that resonated across time and distance. The fairy tales we know today are descended from a much darker lineage than most people realize. In medieval Europe, these stories were not told to children at bedtime. They were shared among adults in the long winter evenings when work was done and the only light came from the fire. They were raw and violent and sexual, reflecting the brutal realities of a world where life was precarious and death was never far away. In these original versions, there were no gentle fade-outs or happily ever afters, carefully crafted to soothe young minds. Instead, there was cannibalism and incest, rape and murder, mutilation and revenge. The wolf ate Little Red Riding Hood, and that was the end of her story. Snow White's mother, not her stepmother, wanted to devour her daughter's lungs and liver. Sleeping Beauty was not awakened by a chaste kiss, but by childbirth, impregnated while she slept by a king who stumbled upon her unconscious body. These were not stories meant to comfort. They were meant to warn, to prepare, to encode essential information about survival in a dangerous world. They addressed subjects that were taboo to discuss directly, wrapping them in the protective cloak of fantasy so that difficult truths could be transmitted without causing scandal or offense. Through the veil of magic and enchantment, people could speak about things they could not otherwise name. The sexual awakening of young women, the dangers of strangers, the cruelty that could lurk within families, the hunger that drove people to monstrous acts, the transitions and transformations that mark the passage from childhood to adulthood. Folklore researchers have long recognized that many fairy tales owe their remarkable longevity to this ability to address forbidden topics in symbolic language, to say the unsayable by not quite saying it at all. As centuries passed, these stories began to transform. The Renaissance brought the first written collections, compiled by men like Giovanni Francesco Straparola in 16th century Italy, who gathered bawdy tales and published them as literary entertainment for educated adults. These early collections made no pretense of morality or suitability for children. They were full of vernacular language and sexual innuendo, reflecting the relaxed moral attitudes of the time, but gradually, as literacy spread and books became more common, something shifted. Writers and collectors began to see potential in these old folk tales, not as adult entertainment, but as tools for shaping young minds and instilling proper behaviour. In France, Charles Perrault became one of the first to deliberately reshape fairy tales into moral lessons for children. His versions, published in the late 17th century, softened some of the violence and added explicit morals at the end, making clear what lesson the reader was meant to draw. But even Perrault could not completely domesticate these wild stories. His Little Red Riding Hood remained a cautionary tale about young women who listen to strangers, ending with the girl devoured by the wolf, and a moral warning about the dangers of talking to men with smooth voices and charming manners. The wolf, in Perrault's telling, was not merely an animal, but a metaphor for sexual predators who preyed upon naive young women. The red cloak itself became symbolic, that bold colour suggesting passion, menstrual blood, the crossing of a threshold into sexual maturity. The most dramatic transformation of fairy tales came with the brothers Grimm in early 19th century Germany. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm set out to collect traditional German folk tales as part of a larger project of defining German cultural identity during a time of political upheaval and foreign occupation. They travelled through the countryside gathering stories from peasants and villagers, believing they were preserving ancient Germanic traditions that stretched back into the mists of prehistory. But even as they collected, they edited. With each new edition of their tales, they made subtle changes, smoothing rough edges, removing sexual content, replacing mothers with stepmothers to preserve the sanctity of motherhood, adding redemptive endings and Christian morality. The Grimm brothers wanted their tales to serve the social good, to be instruments of discipline and proper behaviour, warnings delivered through fear wrapped in fantasy. Yet something remarkable happened. Even as these stories were sanitized and adapted, even as they were reshaped to serve the purposes of their collectors and editors, they retained their power. The archetypal patterns embedded within them proved remarkably resistant to change. No matter how much the surface details were altered, the deep structure remained intact. The stories continued to speak to something fundamental in the human psyche, something that transcended culture and era. This is because fairy tales at their core are expressions of what the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, that deep reservoir of shared human experience and inherited patterns of thought that exists beneath individual consciousness. Jung spent much of his career studying fairy tales, myths and dreams, recognizing them as windows into the universal aspects of human psychology. He identified recurring patterns he called archetypes, innate ideas or images that appear across cultures and throughout history in the stories people tell. The mother, the child, the trickster, the hero, the shadow. These figures emerge again and again in fairy tales because they represent fundamental aspects of human experience and development. Jung believed that fairy tales provided a kind of map of the psyche, illustrating in symbolic language the processes of psychological growth and transformation that every person must undergo. When we encounter these stories, especially in childhood, they speak to us on a level deeper than conscious understanding, activating ancient patterns and preparing us for the challenges we will face as we mature. This perspective was further developed by Bruno Bettelheim, the controversial psychoanalyst who wrote extensively about the psychological importance of fairy tales for children. Bettelheim argued that fairy tales help children work through their deepest anxieties and conflicts in a safe symbolic space. The wicked stepmother represents the child's complicated feelings toward their real mother, who sometimes nurtures and sometimes frustrates. The dangerous forest symbolizes the unknown world beyond the safety of home that the child must eventually enter. The magical helpers and protective animals represent inner resources and intuition that can guide us through difficulty. The happy ending assures the child that struggles can be overcome, and that growth, though painful, leads to fulfillment. According to Bettelheim, when we deprive children of these dark, complex fairy tales and substitute bland, cheerful stories with no real conflict or danger, we rob them of crucial tools for psychological development. Let us now turn our attention to one of the most famous fairy tales of all, Snow White, and examine what secret messages lie hidden beneath its familiar surface. You know the story, or you think you do. A beautiful princess, skin white as snow, lips red as blood, hair black as ebony. A jealous stepmother who cannot bear to be surpassed in beauty. A magic mirror that speaks truth. A huntsman ordered to kill the girl but who cannot bring himself to do it. 7 dwarfs who take her in. A poisoned apple that sends her into a death-like sleep. A prince whose kiss awakens her. Happily ever after. Simple enough. A straightforward tale of good versus evil, beauty versus jealousy, innocence versus corruption. But look closer. Look deeper. And you will see that Snow White is nothing less than a symbolic representation of the human soul's journey through darkness toward enlightenment, a map of psychological death and rebirth, a meditation on transformation and the conflicts inherent in feminine identity and power. The story begins with a queen, Snow White's mother in the original version, pricking her finger while sewing by a window in winter. 3 drops of blood fall on the snow, and seeing the contrast of red on white against the black ebony of the window frame, she wishes for a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, hair as black as ebony. Here already we encounter profound symbolism. The 3 colours, white, red and black, appear throughout alchemy, mythology and fairy tales as stages of transformation. White represents innocence, purity, the unformed potential. Red signifies life force, passion, blood, the vital energy. Black symbolizes death, dissolution, the unknown, the shadow. Together they represent the full spectrum of existence, the cycle of birth, life, and death that every being must pass through. Snow White herself embodies these colours, suggesting that she contains within herself all the potential for transformation. The mother dies after giving birth, as often happens in fairy tales, and is replaced by a stepmother. This cruel stepmother figure has been interpreted in many ways. From a psychological perspective, she represents the negative mother complex, those destructive thought patterns and beliefs about ourselves that we internalize, often from our early relationships. She is the voice that tells us we are not good enough, not beautiful enough, not worthy enough. She is jealousy and insecurity personified. She is what happens when identity becomes too narrowly focused on external qualities like beauty that inevitably fade with time. The stepmother's dependency on the magic mirror is telling. She asks it every day who is the fairest in the land, seeking external validation for her worth. The mirror, symbol of reflection and self-knowledge, tells the truth, but it is a truth the stepmother cannot bear. When it names Snow White as fairer, the stepmother's entire sense of self is threatened. She must destroy the younger woman to preserve her own fragile identity. The stepmother orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her, bringing back her lungs and liver as proof. The forest in fairy tales is always a place of transformation, a liminal space between the known world and the unknown, between childhood and adulthood, between conscious and unconscious. It is where we face our fears and find our strength. It is dangerous and dark, but also filled with possibility. Snow White's entry into the forest represents her forced ejection from childhood innocence into the harsh realities of the world. She's being initiated, though she does not know it yet, into a deeper understanding of existence. The huntsman cannot bring himself to kill the innocent girl. Instead, he leaves her in the woods and kills a boar, presenting its organs to the stepmother who eats them, believing them to be Snow White's. This act of cannibalism, present in many fairy tales, speaks to the consuming nature of jealousy and narcissism, the way these forces literally devour life and vitality. Alone and terrified in the forest, Snow White is surrounded by frightening animals and menacing shadows. But as she falls to the ground in fear, something unexpected happens. Small creatures emerge from the forest, rabbits and squirrels, deer and birds. They gather around her with gentle friendliness, sensing her pure heart. These animals, according to metaphysical interpretations, represent intuitive guidance, those hunches and instincts that can lead us to safety when rational thought fails us. They guide Snow White to a little house belonging to 7 dwarfs. The number 7 appears repeatedly in fairy tales, mythology and religion, carrying symbolic weight as a number of completion and spirituality. 7 days of creation, 7 deadly sins, 7 virtues, 7 chakras, 7 visible planets in ancient astronomy. The 7 dwarfs can be understood as protective forces within the psyche, aspects of the personality that help us survive and cope with difficulty. Snow White makes a home with them, doing domestic labour, cooking and cleaning in a kind of extended childhood, a protected space where she can develop before facing the next challenge. But the stepmother's mirror eventually reveals that Snow White still lives. 3 times the stepmother comes to the cottage in disguise. 3 times she attempts to kill Snow White with progressively more effective methods, first with a bodice laced so tightly the girl cannot breathe, then with a poisoned comb, and finally with the poisoned apple. 3 attempts, that magical number appearing again, representing the trials we must face, the persistence required for true transformation. The apple itself is dense with symbolism. It is the fruit of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, the golden apple of discord that sparked the Trojan War, the fruit of the ancient goddess religions associated with fertility in the underworld. In Snow White, the apple is split between red and green, poisoned on one side and safe on the other, representing the dual nature of experience, pleasure and pain, life and death existing together in the same moment. When Snow White bites the poisoned apple, she falls into a death-like sleep so profound that the dwarfs believe she has died. They place her in a glass coffin, unable to bury her because she remains so lifelike. This sleep is not merely physical, it is a descent into the underworld of the unconscious, a necessary death of the old self before the new self can emerge. Many mythological and fairy tale heroines undergo this death and resurrection pattern. Persephone descends to Hades. Inanna travels to the underworld and hangs on a hook, dead before being revived. Sleeping Beauty pricks her finger and sleeps for 100 years. These stories all encode the same truth, that transformation requires a kind of death, a letting go of what we were to become what we must be. Snow White's time in the glass coffin is a cocoon state, a gestation period. She appears dead to the outside world, but within, deep changes are occurring. The prince appears, and in the grim version, his servants carry the glass coffin, stumbling, and the piece of poisoned apple dislodges from Snow White's throat, bringing her back to life. In other versions, his kiss awakens her. Either way, the prince represents the animus, the masculine principle that activates and awakens the feminine. In Jungian psychology, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman's psyche, the force that drives her to act in the world, to assert herself, to engage with external reality. The prince can also be understood as representing the divine plan for one's life, the higher purpose that calls us back from the underworld of depression and unconsciousness into active engagement with existence. Snow White awakens not as the innocent child she was, but as a woman who has travelled through darkness and emerged transformed, ready for the sacred marriage, the union of opposites that represents psychological wholeness. The stepmother, meanwhile, faces her own fate. In the grim version, she is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she falls dead, a punishment that matches her crime, her vanity and cruelty literally burning her away. In other interpretations, she is simply swept away by a storm, dissolved and dissipated, because once transformation is complete, those old negative patterns no longer have power. The thought forms that tormented us lose their grip. We are, as the fairy tale promises, free to live happily ever after, which does not mean a life without challenges, but rather a life lived from a place of wholeness and integration, no longer at the mercy of the cruel stepmother within who tells us we are not enough. Now let us turn our attention to another beloved tale, Cinderella, whose story has been told and retold in countless variations across cultures. There are versions of Cinderella from China dating back to the 9th century, from ancient Egypt, from Native American traditions, from virtually every corner of the world. This universality suggests that the story touches on something deeply archetypal, a pattern of experience that resonates across human cultures. At its surface, Cinderella is a rags to riches story, a fantasy of rescue and wish fulfillment. A poor, mistreated girl catches the eye of a prince and is elevated to royalty, escaping her suffering through the intervention of magic and her own inherent goodness. But beneath this simple narrative lie complex messages about identity, transformation, and the nature of the self. Cinderella lives in a state of psychological oppression, forced to sleep among the cinders and ashes of the hearth, while her stepmother and stepsisters enjoy comfort and status. The hearth itself is symbolically significant, representing the heart of the home, the sacred centre where fire, that transformative element, burns. By sleeping in the ashes, Cinderella is in a position of objection and also in proximity to the alchemical fire that will eventually transform her. The ashes represent the burned away remains of the old life, the dissolved ego from which something new can emerge. In many versions of the story, Cinderella's connection to her dead mother is emphasized. She visits her mother's grave, waters it with her tears, and a tree grows there that will later provide her with help. This tree, often a hazel tree, represents the continuing presence of the nurturing mother energy, even after physical death, the deep roots of identity and self-worth that cannot be destroyed by external circumstances. The fairy godmother, that magical figure who appears to help Cinderella attend the ball, is another manifestation of this maternal energy, but also represents grace, the unexpected intervention of forces beyond our control that arrive at crucial moments. She transforms ordinary objects, a pumpkin into a coach, mice into horses, rags into a ball gown, using her magic wand to reveal the hidden potential in humble things. This transformation speaks to the idea that our true nature is always present, merely hidden under layers of circumstance and conditioning. The beautiful gown and glass slippers do not make Cinderella someone she is not. They reveal who she has always been beneath the soot and cinders. The glass slipper itself is perhaps the most famous symbol in the story. Glass is transparent, revealing truth. The slipper fits only Cinderella, suggesting that true identity cannot be faked or forced. We are who we are, and the right path will fit us like a glove, or in this case like a shoe. The midnight deadline that the fairy godmother imposes, the warning that the magic will end at 12, introduces the element of time and limitation that makes the story more than a simple wish fulfillment fantasy. Cinderella must return to her ordinary life. She cannot remain in the enchanted state indefinitely. This speaks to the reality that transformation is a process, not a single event. We touch moments of grace and heightened experience, but we must also return to the mundane world, integrating what we have learned. The Prince's Ball itself, held over 3 nights in many versions, represents the opportunities that appear in life for us to show our true selves, to step out of the roles that confine us and be seen for who we really are. Each night Cinderella attends the ball, she is practicing being her authentic self, building courage, until finally she is ready to leave behind the glass slipper, a clue to her identity, trusting that what is meant for her will find its way back. The search for the woman whose foot fits the slipper is another powerful element. The stepsisters, in the original Grimm version, mutilate their own feet, cutting off toes and heels to try to fit into the shoe, their blood staining the slipper and revealing their deception. This gruesome detail, removed from sanitized children's versions, contains an important message about the dangers of trying to force ourselves into identities or roles that do not truly fit us. When we cut away parts of ourselves to meet external expectations, when we harm ourselves to fit into someone else's definition of who we should be, the results are painful and ultimately futile. The true self will always reveal itself. Only Cinderella's foot fits the slipper perfectly, because only she is herself. She has not tried to be anyone else. She has remained true to her nature even in the most oppressive circumstances. And it is this authenticity, this refusal to let external conditions destroy her inner nobility, that allows her to be recognized and claimed. The transformation of Cinderella from scullery maid to princess can be read as an external social rise, but more importantly, it represents an internal recognition of worth. The prince does not give Cinderella value. He recognizes the value that was always present. In some interpretations, the prince himself represents Cinderella's own masculine energy, her capacity to act on her own behalf, to claim her place in the world. The marriage at the end is the sacred union of inner opposites, the integration of the disowned and oppressed parts of the self with conscious identity. Cinderella, who dwelt in shadow, steps into the light. And in that light, she is whole. Let us shift now to Little Red Riding Hood, perhaps the most analysed and reinterpreted fairy tale in the Western canon, a story so rich with sexual symbolism and so concerned with themes of danger, innocence and predation that it has become a cultural touchstone for discussions of female vulnerability and agency. The story seems simple enough on the surface. A young girl is sent by her mother to take food to a sick grandmother. She's told to stay on the path through the woods. She encounters a wolf who tricks her into revealing where her grandmother lives, then races ahead to devour the grandmother and disguise himself in her clothes. When Little Red Riding Hood arrives, she is also eaten. In Perrault's version, that is the end. The wolf wins. The girl is dead. The moral, explicitly stated, warns young women not to trust charming strangers, for some wolves do not look like wolves at all. The red cloak that gives the girl her name is loaded with meaning. Red is the colour of blood, of menstruation, of sexual maturity. In many interpretations, Little Red Riding Hood is understood as a story about a girl on the threshold of womanhood, her red cloak signalling her transition from child to sexually mature female. Her journey through the woods represents her passage through this dangerous transitional phase, where she's no longer a child but not yet fully an adult, vulnerable to predators who recognize her awakening sexuality before she fully understands it herself. The wolf, speaking with smooth charm, convinces her to leave the path, to gather flowers, to linger and play. He represents temptation, seduction, the predatory masculine that seeks to exploit female innocence and inexperience. Feminist reinterpretations of the tale have focused on reclaiming Little Red Riding Hood from her role as passive victim. Writers like Angela Carter have reimagined the story, giving the girl agency and power, allowing her to recognize the beast in the man, and crucially, to recognize the beast in herself. In Carter's versions, Little Red Riding Hood is not devoured. Instead, she becomes the wolf's equal, embracing her own wild nature, her own capacity for fierce desire and survival. These retellings argue that the sexuality and liberation of women is not a weakness to be protected, but a source of power to be claimed. The girl who was once prey becomes hunter, or better yet transcends the predator-prey dynamic entirely, joining with the wolf in a union based on mutual recognition and acceptance. Little Red Riding Hood stood at the edge of a tangled forest, a story so simple, yet so rich in meaning that for centuries listeners and readers have shivered not merely at the wolf's grin, but at the shadows cast by meaning itself. Tonight, we will move deeper into the heart of that symbolic wilderness, where each leaf, each path forks not just in the world of story, but in the gentle twistings of our own minds. Wherever you are, allow yourself to grow even more comfortable. Let us slow our pace and settle further, focusing on how fairy tales, like the roots of ancient trees, stretch beneath the surface of consciousness. They do not simply entertain, they educate, caution, and awaken us to the unseen cycles within ourselves and the world. In the hush of the night, ask yourself, not aloud, just softly within. What stories have followed you since childhood? Which images linger at the edges of dreams? Fairy tales speak their truths not in plain language, but in symbols as layered as sediment beneath the forest floor. Take the mirror, so central to tales like Snow White. A mirror is never merely a reflective glass. In stories it becomes a threshold, offering not just the twin of our face, but a glimpse of who we are beneath masks and bravado. Mirrors in fairy tales often bring forth the duality of self, the tension between how we appear to others and what reality lies hidden within. This symbol invites us to wonder how much of our lives are lived in reflection and in whose eyes we seek approval. Mirrors pierce the ordinary, and as we gaze, we're forced to consider not just how we are seen, but more deeply, how we see ourselves. Now picture the rose. In countless tales it is the prize that must be plucked, the gift that costs more than one might first suspect. The rose is sensuality and vulnerability, allure and danger. Its beauty invites, but its thorns protect. In beauty there is risk. Love can wound as well as heal. The rose in myth and fairy tale whispers of both spiritual yearning and earthly desire, its petals unfolding layer by layer, a perfect metaphor for a story or a soul. Equally potent is the key, a small and humble object, yet charged with possibility. A key, in any narrative, is a sign of access, to rooms once locked, to secrets kept, to knowledge forbidden or forgotten. When a character receives or discovers a key, it marks a turning, an invitation to cross thresholds, literal and metaphorical. To possess a key is to be burdened with choice, for what is unlocked may delight or terrify. In this way, keys symbolize agency and the shift from innocence to awareness, an echo of the moment in each life when we first open the door to the mysterious and the unknown. The symbolism of ordinary objects, mirrors, roses, keys, draw us deep into the self, into journeys of enlightenment, change, and self-reflection. They lift common things into the realm of the mythic, offering, each time they appear, an invitation. Look deeper, listen again, for something waits for you just beneath the surface. But symbolism in fairy tales is not confined to objects. Often, animals serve as spirit guides, messengers from the deeper places of the psyche. Consider the animals who flock to Snow White's side, or the talking wolf whose presence remakes the woods for Little Red Riding Hood. Owls, foxes, deer, and frogs. Their appearances are far from random. Each animal carries its own wisdom, a lesson for both the character and the listening child. The wise owl may symbolize the value of quiet perception. The wolf may embody our own cunning or hidden fears, and the loyal dog might speak to the true heart of friendship and faith. These animals help protagonists through trials, but more than that, they act as mirrors for the reader, drawing forth parts of ourselves that remain half-tamed and wild. In the stories told beside old firelight, animals serve as bridges to parts of the soul that resist domestication. They tug at the leaden parts of the narrative, reminding listeners that instinct and emotion, loyalty and cunning are as much a part of the human condition as logic and reason. They ask us to honor our connection to the natural world, and by doing so to the mysterious within our very selves. The landscape of the fairy tale, too, is never incidental. The dark forest is a symbol older than written language. It is the realm of the unknown, of dangers and discoveries. In psychology, this forest is often interpreted as the shadow self, the part of us we fear or repress. When a hero or heroine steps off the path and into the woods, they are embarking on a journey through uncertainty, loss and transformation. The monsters that lurk there, the trials that await, are those very challenges we must all face in growing up, or simply in living through the cycles of life. The sea, sometimes appearing as the final horizon in stories like The Little Mermaid, stands for vastness, mystery, the unconscious, the deep blue that both beckons and threatens. Forest, sea, mountain, storm. These become archetypal landscapes, their meanings evolving as the teller shapes the tale and the listener imagines their own way through it. Each reader, in turn, finds their own meanings in this geography, drawing from it the understanding needed at each stage of life. Let us pause for a moment on the symbolism of numbers and colours, so pervasive in the fairy tale tradition that we almost cease to notice. The number 3, for instance, is everywhere. 3 drops of blood, 3 wishes, 3 brothers or sisters, 3 challenges to overcome. 3 marks the beginning, middle, and end, the movement from confusion to order, the ritual of transformation. 7, likewise, recurs. The 7 dwarfs, 7 league boots, 7 mountains to cross. 7 is the mystical, the complete reminiscent of days, wonders, struggles. Such numbers offer a secret mathematics to the world of folklore, pointing toward hidden unity and meaning. Colours, too, are charged. Red for passion, danger, and awakening. A cloak, a rose, a drop of blood. White for purity and new beginnings. Snow, lilies, pale skin untouched by sun or experience. Black for mystery, mourning, or the unknown watchfulness of the night. Blue for hope and longing, and gold for triumph or royal inheritance. It is no accident that these hues appear with such deliberation. Through them, simple stories come alive with feeling, their meaning colouring the listener's imagination long after the tale is ended. Transformation is perhaps the deepest message embedded in the tapestry of fairy tales. Characters, often the humble, the slighted, the young, the overlooked, undergo changes more profound than mere surface disguise. The beast becomes the beloved, the cinder girl the princess, the frog the friend. These changes reflect back to us the fundamental truth. To live is to change. Sometimes, as in the poignant journey of the Little Mermaid, transformation comes at great cost and with pain, sacrificing parts of oneself, voice, home, certainty, to seek a new life. These stories do not guarantee happy endings. Instead, they offer something more enigmatic, more honest, the knowledge that transformation is always possible and always risky. To step into the unknown is a leap of courage, and sometimes, even in loss, there is a new kind of wholeness. Fairy tales unfold the ways we contend with our own shadows. In Beauty and the Beast, as the young woman learns to see past the creature's monstrous appearance, so too do we learn to acknowledge and embrace our own imperfections, our anxieties and desires that hide in the attic of our hearts. These stories offer a safe space in which to confront our greatest fears and to imagine, in whatever small way, reconciliation between the warring parts of the self. As you listen, consider how, with each retelling and each hearing, the stories seem to shift, mirrors reflecting not only the teller but the time and place in which they are told. Fairy tales are never static. Their meanings grow and metamorphose with us. A child may hear only the terror of the wolf or the sweetness of the happy ending, but the adult upon returning finds new metaphors for struggle, disappointment, hope, and redemption. Each generation, facing its own challenges, re-envisions and retells these tales, shaping the same familiar structure to new needs and new truths. In one era, a tale of Cinderella is a lesson in humility and patience. In another, it is a story of claiming one's worth and resisting oppressive power. Snow White, once a morality play about envy and virtue, can become a meditation on identity, and the harm of perpetual comparison. The stories endure because they are flexible, their core messages clothed in symbols ready to take on new significance with each new era. Each attentive listener, let us not overlook the power of the ordinary in these stories either. The meals eaten, the chores done, even the time spent alone at hearth or field. These moments remind us that fairy tale magic is not only found in the extraordinary, but in the transformation of everyday life. The mundane is shown to be sacred, every action a possible threshold to greater meaning. The teardrop, the whispered wish, the kernel of kindness to a stranger or a bird, all of these, in the world of the fairy tale, have the power to change fates and bring reward. Here, everyday gestures become vessels for hope and catalysts for change. It is in this spirit that fairy tales encourage us, gently and repeatedly, to look twice at our own world. What do we overlook or dismiss as simple, when in truth it is charged with possibility? A pebble in the road, a kind word exchanged, the strange hush that falls before sleep. Ordinary moments conceal extraordinary truths, and so the message beneath the surface is clear. Pay attention. Magic is not only for the chosen or the exceptional, it is the birthright of any who are willing to see with new eyes and to listen beyond mere words. Let us drift further into the symbolic heart of fairy tales, where each new image and transformation gently invites us into deeper understanding. Take a slow breath and settle in. Tonight, we'll move beyond mere story and listen for the hidden language spoken by the world itself. Weather in the world of fairy tales is never mute. Snow often falls at the moment of awakening. Think of Snow White's birth, when drops of blood fall upon bright drifts of winter. Snow is purity and innocence, but it also brings cold isolation and the hush that precedes change. Storms crackle across the page to herald discord or the feeling of turmoil within, a flash of lightning, a rush of wind, marking the exact turning point when fate shifts. When skies clear and sunlight returns, it is never just the world outside that has changed, but the inner state of characters who have struggled, endured, and grown braver through adversity. Water, too, is more than landscape. In many tales, wells, rivers, and seas form boundaries that must be crossed, a symbol for moving between worlds or into deeper layers of the self. The well in fairy tales such as Mother Holle is a portal, dropping the heroine from ordinary labour into the extraordinary. Rivers in stories pulse with the energy of renewal, each crossing a chance for transformation, for the shedding of former identity. Seas, boundless and mysterious, often evoke wonder, fear, and longing. The Little Mermaid, trading tail and voice for a new form, shows how transformation through water can require sacrifice, embodying at once freedom, loss, and the uncertain hope of a changed life. Plant life and trees are rarely just silent witnesses. In some stories, a rose is not only a token of love or beauty, it is the very axis around which transformation turns. To take or give a flower is to accept challenge or embark on a new fate, as in Beauty and the Beast, where one rose changes the course of many lives. Trees, ancient, watchful, deeply rooted, often serve as guardians or guides. The hazel, the oak, or even a rowan branch may protect, advise, or grant passage. Sometimes a stick, when gifted with intention, becomes a magical tool, a promise of growth or renewal. In tales where the beanstalk grows overnight to the sky, nature's magic invites the hero to step beyond the limits of possibility. Colour is woven into these stories like secret thread. Red is the hue of vitality, a cloak, a rose, a poisoned apple. It signals both invitation and warning, promise and peril. Red shouts, beware, while also heralding passion and the moment of stepping from childhood into the tangles of risk and grown desire. White shines as purity and unknowing, as in a swan's feathers or a winter field, but also speaks of isolation and waiting, of spirit unshaped by experience. Black, darkness, and shadow mark the presence of mystery, the unknown depth of the world and the self, and sometimes the stage for redemption. Gold, yellow, green. These colours too signal transformation, hope, or the brush of the sacred within the everyday. Every fairy tale is, at its secret core, an anatomy of transformation. In every narrative, change is the currency of magic. A mermaid becomes a woman, a beast shows his human heart, a child endures suffering and steps into agency or love. But transformation is never merely external. Often, it is the character's courage, endurance, or act of kindness that makes the churning of change possible. The hardships they undergo, silently weaving shirts from nettles, facing storms, descending into wells, are metaphors for patience, sacrifice, and the alchemy of the soul. Sometimes the journey requires a literal alteration, a spell to break, a curse to lift, an identity to shed or reclaim. Sometimes the world around the hero must change as much as the hero themselves. In weaving and textile tales, for example, each act of spinning, weaving, or dyeing mirrors the process by which a person, experience by experience, becomes the person they are meant to be. To transform wool into cloth, as an old woman might teach her fairy godchild, is both practical and mystical, a lesson in patience and faith, in the everyday magic that we work with our own hands. At the same time, fairy tales gently insist that we reckon with our shadows. Every wolfish threat, every stepmother's cruelty, the darkness behind the mirror, these are not just villains to be vanquished. They are parts of ourselves to be seen, acknowledged, and, in some deep sense, befriended. When Belle learns to see past the beast's frightening exterior, or when the stepsisters in Cinderella harm themselves in pursuit of an ill-fitting dream, the stories offer not condemnation, but reminders. They urge us to look honestly at our own frailties and unkindness, our longing and regret. To transform, truly, is to see both light and shadow clearly, to accept, integrate, and find the power in that wholeness. Dreams and stories both work through symbols, giving us a language for the inner world. Fairy tales, with their cats who speak and shoes that fit only the true self, model the work of interpreting what cannot be said outright. In this way, the tales become gentle companions through our own passages, offering comfort, challenge, and a quiet recognition that every listener walks their own winding path through the forest, seeking the treasures, lessons, and changes that only story can reveal. Now, as we drift further into the symbol-laden world of fairy tales, let your mind relax into the rhythms and undercurrents of meaning that pulse beneath each story's surface. The tales are not simply entertainment, they are coded messages, a language of images and ideas that speak to the secret longings, anxieties, and hopes woven into every human heart. If you listen gently, you will hear how these ancient whispers continue their work, from the shadows at the edges of the firelight, from the deep folds of our own unconscious. A core feature of fairy tales is metamorphosis, change so complete and sudden that the world itself seems made new. Many scholars, such as Max Müller and Marie-Louise von Franz, have shown that the motif of transformation is among the oldest and most universal elements in folklore, signalling the foundational truth that all life is cyclical, always in a state of becoming and dissolving. In The Frog Prince, a lowly amphibian cracks open to reveal a noble heart, In Beauty and the Beast, the monstrous is only a mask for what is most tender, and each lover must transform to truly meet the other. Metamorphosis is the vehicle for rebirth, not just of the characters within a tale, but of the listener who absorbs and reenacts these patterns in the private world of dreams and waking challenges. This theme of cyclicality expands beyond physical transformation. It stretches into the patterns of nature that surround us: seasons, moon phases, the spiral of birth and death, renewal and loss. Fairy tales are themselves ritualized dramas echoing ancient myth and community ceremony, threading together the human and the cosmic. The roles we see, victim, hero, trickster, wise old woman, are not merely characters but archetypes. Each holds a place in an invisible cycle, offering the audience a mirror of their own psychic journey. As Carl Jung noted, these archetypes are repositories of wisdom, carrying the symbolic nourishment needed for healing and growth. The recurring journey into the unknown, be it a forest, underworld, or dreamscape, acts as initiation, separating, testing, and then reintegrating the one who walks the path, just as ancient rites guided the journey from childhood to adulthood, ignorance to knowledge. Consider the symbol of swallowing, both literal and metaphorical. In countless tales from Red Riding Hood to the Greek myth of Kronos, figures are devoured and crucially reborn. This act of swallowing becomes a metaphor for acquiescence, for the way we must sometimes surrender to forces greater than ourselves if we are to survive transformation. As folk literature scholar Herrero points out, tales often draw upon experiential metaphors: light for intelligence, darkness for concealment, animals for instinct and cunning, children as vessels of renewal. The act of being swallowed or disappearing into darkness is not the end, but the threshold. The pilgrim emerges anew, changed by ordeal. The tales teach us that darkness is a cover, a chrysalis in which the possible takes shape. And what of the apparent contradictions within fairy tale figures? Characters who are at once threatening and protective, cruel and redemptive. These shifting qualities mirror the contradictions within ourselves. The stepmother, often accused of malice, may also serve as a fearsome guide, pushing the protagonist into the world beyond the comfortable hearth. The wolf is both destroyer and source of knowledge. The old woman on the margins is sometimes a helper in disguise. The permeability of roles teaches that identity is fluid. Fortune and fate may shift overnight. In this, the tales offer a coded lesson in adaptability, wisdom, and survival. To encounter challenge not as the end, but as invitation to growth. Magic in fairy tales is not lawless. Rather, it enacts an invisible order, echoing the rules and patterns of the cosmos. Wishes, curses, and boons play by their own logic, one often grounded in a sense of justice. Kindness is rewarded, arrogance undone. Yet there is always the awareness that the otherworldly operates according to rules we only half grasp. The price of transformation, the danger of careless speech or broken promises, and the demand for patience are woven through the stories, encouraging listeners to respect the balance between freedom and responsibility. Magic, then, is not only a source of wonder, but a subtle teacher, drawing attention to the tension between will and fate. Central to the workings of fairy tales is the function of metaphor, simple stories acting as containers for deeply embedded ideas. As recent scholarship illustrates, tales can be organized and understood through the basic metaphors they repeat. People as animals, plants, or objects. Love as magic, imperfection as irregularity. By embodying qualities in animals or enchanted beings, tales bring abstract qualities into vivid focus: cunning, loyalty, transformation, hope. As these metaphors recur across world cultures, they allow different audiences to recognize a shared humanity. This suggests why, wherever people have gathered around a fire or a printed page, the fundamental plots of fairy tales reappear, clothed in new names but carrying old truths. Notice too the power of light in fairy tales. Where there is light, there is hope, clarity, and the promise of change. The torch, lantern, or star that guides a lost child home is more than an object. It represents enlightenment, intelligence, the spark of insight that allows us to pierce confusion. Yet the stories also honour darkness not merely as the absence of light, but as fertile ground for transformation, concealment, and rest. Both bright and shadowed, the world of fairy tale is always in dynamic balance. In recognizing this, the tales lead us toward acceptance, patience, and trust in the rhythms of life. In every shared tale, there is also a deep invitation to contemplate which story you're living right now. Fairy tales are healing, as Marie-Louise von Franz and Bruno Bettelheim have written, because they supply a language for what might otherwise remain wordless. Feelings of exile or hope, the search for belonging, the anxious passage through change. By reflecting on your own favourite tale, you begin to notice the figures and themes that replay in your own life. The inner stepmother, the path not taken, the gift or curse that changes everything. Just as the characters find themselves tested and transformed, so too do we encounter moments where only by accepting our shadows and listening for guidance do we find our way forward. With each retelling, with every generation that adds its voice, fairy tales find new life. They morph to fit the morality, technology, and anxieties of the times. Yet at their heart, the old lessons persist: humility, courage, cleverness, the necessity of accepting both joy and sorrow. They remind us that magic is found both in the world and in the spirit, that danger and wonder are intertwined, and that we are all, in some measure, seekers walking toward the unknown, guided by the lamp of story. As you settle even deeper into this gentle exploration, notice how fairy tales begin to appear not just as simple stories for children, but as profound psychological maps. Their power is not accidental. Scholars such as Carl Jung and his student Marie-Louise von Franz have long argued that fairy tales are among our purest expressions of the collective unconscious, a term Jung used to describe the inherited shared patterns deep within every human mind. Where myths overtly speak to the destiny of nations or heroes, fairy tales often reveal archetypes, the timeless universal personalities and situations that echo across cultures and history. At the heart of these stories are archetypes: the hero or heroine, the wise elder, the trickster, the shadow figure, and many others. These figures are not fully fleshed out personalities like those in modern fiction. They are, as von Franz explains, schematic, each standing more as a symbol than a psychological portrait. The hero is not a particular person with a complex inner life, but a model of courage, persistence, and transformation. Sometimes clever, sometimes seemingly foolish, always passing through story as an agent of change. This lack of individual detail allows us, the listeners, to project ourselves more easily onto these archetypes, to live vicariously through their journeys. Von Franz described fairy tales as the simplest mirrors of the psyche, because they contain less of the cultural and personal overlays that colour myths and legends. Where myths might embody the ideals or anxieties of entire civilizations, fairy tales show the basic psychological structures with fewer distractions. That is why you might find the same plot: a child lost in a woods, a quest for a magical object, a confrontation with a devouring monster, not just in the European tales you know, but in the folk traditions of faraway places, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. The patterns are innate, part of what Jung called archetypes, primordial images that represent fundamental human experiences and emotions. In their universality, fairy tales become a kind of common language for humanity, a code for emotional truths. It doesn't much matter the outward trappings, whether the protagonist wears rags or robes, whether the landscape is forest, desert, or mountain. The stories resonate because deep down they enact the passage through fear and loss, confrontation with the unknown, and the possibility of renewal and wholeness. The character of the shadow appears, the wolf in the woods, the wicked stepmother, the giant or dragon, to embody the dark side of the psyche, those traits or experiences we often wish to deny. In facing these figures, fairy tale characters act out a drama of integration, teaching us by example to find the courage to acknowledge and transform our own shadows. This process is more than storytelling. Fairy tales function as psychological rituals, setting out a sequence that mirrors the human need to grow, change, and heal. Psychological readings often highlight motifs like descent and ascent, from daylight into the world of night, from the ordinary realm into the magical or forbidden. Every time the hero enters the forest, descends into the underworld, or takes the impossible road, the journey echoes that of the individual moving beneath the surface of waking consciousness, confronting chaos and returning, changed, to ordinary life. These archetypal journeys take place in all manner of tales: Cinderella's rise from ashes to royal wedding, Rapunzel's liberation from the tower, Hansel and Gretel's clever escape from devouring danger. Archetypes are not static. They dance and shift, sometimes appearing in unusual combinations. There are the wise old women who, while often cast as helpers or mothers, can also change form themselves, sometimes benevolent, sometimes fearsome. Trickster figures, whether in the form of foxes, talking cats, or clever youngest sons, force change and reordering of the world. Even the so-called simple fool becomes the catalyst for transformation, his naivety and openness to possibility that can outwit the cleverest villain. These roles are fluid, because what matters is not just the outcome but the act of transformation itself. Each listener finds their own reflection within these archetypes, filling them with personal meaning. A fairy tale's enduring power lies in its capacity to express the shape of the psyche in ways that logic alone cannot reach. As you listen, remember, when the story lingers in your imagination, a glass slipper glimmering on a staircase, a spindle spinning threads of fate, a beast kneeling before a startled girl, you're encountering not only the residue of forgotten cultures, but the living symbols that help structure your own experience. In this way, fairy tales are always contemporary, always waiting to be lived anew. Now we'll drift further into the world of archetypes, those recurring character types that dwell at the heart of every enduring fairy tale. These archetypes not only provide comfort through their familiarity, but encode psychological truths that help us understand ourselves, one another, and the universal patterns of human experience. Every enchanting tale or quiet fireside story seems to pivot around a handful of essential types. First, the hero or heroine, the soul at the centre, often beginning in humble circumstances, marked by kindness, persistence, or innocence, destined for transformation through adversity. Whether it is Cinderella, endlessly sweeping ash and dreaming in secret, or Jack climbing his beanstalk from hunger to courage, the hero archetype reminds each of us that change is always possible, and value is often concealed beneath unassuming appearances. Near that central figure is the mentor or magical helper, an old woman at the well, a fairy godmother, a wise animal, someone who cannot fight the battle but can provide the insight, tool or blessing that supports the journey. Their wisdom is not always freely given. Sometimes the hero must prove their worthiness, pass a test, or display pure intent before grace descends. This figure echoes our need for guidance, for elders who can see further down the path and light the lantern when our way seems most lost. Facing them, the archetype of the villain, antagonist, or shadow figure. Whether it is a wicked queen, a jealous sibling, an ogre, or the wolf among trees, this character embodies the fears, doubts, or darker drives within ourselves and our world. They are not mere obstacles but invitations, challenges through which the hero must grow. Through their cunning or cruelty, the hero's virtues are drawn out and made visible as darkness frames the boundaries of light. Then there is the trickster, that unpredictable agent of chaos, sometimes hindering, sometimes helping, always stirring the stilled waters of the tale. A sly fox, a talking cat, or a clever child, the trickster employs wit over brute strength, and in so doing, upends expectations. Their reversals, jokes, and ruses open the narrative to surprise and transformation, underscoring that wisdom and victory may come from playful or unexpected places. We should not forget the guardian or threshold figure. Whether it is a beast at a castle gate, a troll beneath the bridge, or a gatekeeper at the border of two realms, this archetype tests, bars entry, or grants passage only to the worthy. As mythologists explain, such guardians externalize transition points in life, moving from innocence to experience, home into the unknown, or childhood toward maturity. Their challenges ask, are you ready? Have you grown enough to cross over? A subtler but equally vital presence is the shadow self, sometimes appearing as a rival sibling, a double, or a character whose flaws amplify the hero's latent vulnerabilities. In the envious stepsisters of Cinderella, we see possible futures wasted by bitterness or pride. This archetype provides contrast, a lesson in the consequences of unintegrated longing, and sometimes a warning about the paths we might choose. Finally, the shapeshifter, those characters whose loyalties, appearances, or natures shift inexplicably. A beast that becomes a prince, a wolf in grandmother's clothes, a frog transformed by a kiss. The shapeshifter invokes both the treachery of appearances and the excitement of discovering hidden truths. Their transformations mirror our own changes, physical, emotional, and moral, as we cross the thresholds of life. Within these forms, the tales encode not just personal, but societal wisdom. Modern retellings, as recent analysis observes, often subvert or complicate these roles, giving villains humanity, allowing heroines to become helpers to themselves, even breaking down old binary patterns in favor of moral ambiguity and self-awareness. Yet the lasting power of the most traditional tales is their capacity to offer both comfort and complexity, pattern and possibility. These archetypes, more than character types, serve as internal guides. We recognize ourselves in the hard-working Cinderella, in the well-meaning but bumbling simpleton, in the stern teacher or mischievous fox. They allow us to rehearse challenges and victories, griefs and reconciliations, all within the safety of story. So, as you listen to the next fairy tale, or as you wander through memory recalling the tales that shaped your youth, notice which archetypes whisper your own name. Who taught? Who hindered? What guardian's riddle have you faced? What shadowy sibling follows close behind? What magical transformation waits at the end of your current path? Within these ancient figures, Our own journeys find companionship, perspective, and reassurance that the challenges and changes we face are woven into a tapestry as old as story itself. As we journey further into the secret meanings of fairy tales, we find ourselves moving ever closer to the wellspring of human nature and the depths of the collective unconscious. It may seem magical how these tales, told in ordinary words by ordinary people, somehow capture what is most universal and hidden within us, across continents and centuries. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of the foremost students and interpreters of Carl Jung's work, devoted much of her life to exploring why fairy tales hold such enduring power. She concluded that fairy tales are the purest and simplest expression of the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of shared human experiences, ancestral patterns, and primordial images known as archetypes. Unlike myths, which are bound up with national identities and embellished with cultural details, or legends, which draw on supposed events, fairy tales are stripped to their essential elements. They show us the psyche's patterns without the overlay of personality, politics, or historical event. Instead, we see archetypes themselves: hero, shadow, trickster, sage, in their most concentrated form, playing out the basic dramas of transformation, peril, and renewal. Von Franz wrote that in fairy tales you do not find the complexities of the human ego, or the emotional reactions of a real person surprised by a dragon, a talking wolf, or a witch in the woods. Instead, you see schematic figures: the clever child who always tricks their way out of trouble, the innocent maiden who endures trial after trial, the wise old woman or the useless fool. These characters don't flinch or hesitate as we would. They act in accordance with their nature. Because they are not weighed down by psychological realism, listeners can project themselves onto the tale, relating intimately to the situations and challenges, and learning through the drama without fear or judgment. Thus, every time tales are told, listeners and readers enter imaginatively into a world where archetypes dance, where we are all, at one point or another, the hero, the orphan, the villain, the trickster, or the wise one. This is why, for example, the story of Cinderella is not just about one young woman's triumph, but about the universal human yearning to be seen, recognized, and transformed. Each of us, at some level, longs to believe that if we are patient and true, our worth will one day be known. Jung and von Franz distinguish between the collective unconscious, the layer of the psyche where archetypal images dwell, and the personal unconscious, which is made up of each individual's repressed memories, forgotten dreams, and unique complexes. Fairy tales speak primarily to the collective, drawing on imagery and motifs that feel ancient and yet instantly familiar. Within this symbolic language, we encounter fundamental figures and themes: the journey, the challenge, the helper, the dangerous other, the ultimate transformation. The hero or heroine is perhaps the most recognizable archetype. Always starting in humble or diminished circumstances, often orphaned or outcast, the hero is called into adventure, faces a series of challenges or trials, and emerges changed, most often more whole or more self-aware. This basic pattern, sometimes called the hero's journey, is not confined to myths, but is lived out in countless tales: Jack and the Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, and so many more. The repetition of these tales across cultures and epochs reflects a single, shared truth: that to grow, we must leave what is comfortable, face what frightens us, and trust that change, though painful, leads to discovery and renewal. But the journey is not solitary. Fairy tales show a world alive with symbols and helpers, wise old men and women, animals who speak, magical gifts, enchanted objects, and signs that appear in dreams or unexpected moments. These figures and objects are not random decorations, they're extensions of the archetypes, representing the resources and potential within every individual. The giving of a key, the appearance of a magical feather, the sudden insight offered by a creature in disguise. These moments mirror the way new capacities and insights may emerge from the depths or periphery of our own experience. Equally crucial is the archetype of the shadow, that part of the self which is hidden or repressed, the dark double that must be confronted if integration is to be achieved. In fairy tales, the shadow appears as a witch, stepmother, wolf, or even a dragon. Embodiments of traits or desires we find difficult to acknowledge. Psychology suggests that by facing these figures in stories, we prepare ourselves to face them in waking life, learning to accept and transform parts of ourselves we fear. Transformation is the thread weaving all great fairy tales together. These stories are filled with sudden and miraculous changes. A beast becomes a prince, a frog transforms into a companion, a girl in rags is revealed as royalty. These external metamorphoses mirror the inner processes of change, the integration of the shadow, the reconciliation of opposites, the realization of potential. Sometimes the transformation carries a cost. Ariel, the little mermaid, gives up her voice and her old life to follow desire. The miller's daughter must guess Rumpelstiltskin's name through cleverness and endurance. These sacrifices speak to the reality that growth demands letting go, not only of childish illusions, but often of precious or comforting parts of ourselves. The symbolic language of fairy tales is expansive. Common symbols, keys, shoes, knots, food, wells, mirrors, do more than move the plot forward. They are metaphoric stand-ins for the deeper workings of the psyche. A key opens a forbidden room, granting access to hidden forces. A shoe fits only the true self. A mirror reveals what is denied or concealed. The sharing of food binds communities and sometimes seals fates. Even numbers and colours carry potent meaning. 3 brothers, 7 dwarfs, red cloaks, golden apples, each echoing ancient beliefs and psychological truths, pointing to cycles of birth, trial, death, and renewal. The stories also employ place as symbol, the forest as a zone of testing and transformation, the mountain as the site of mastery, the tower as both shelter and prison. Crossing thresholds, doors, gates, rivers, signals the journey from known to unknown, ordinary to extraordinary, safety to danger to new possibility. For all their magical content, fairy tales ultimately invite listeners to engage actively with their own inner life. Within the safe and fantastic trappings of narrative, listeners encounter and rehearse essential questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I fear most, and what might I become if I faced it? Am I the hero or the shadow? Both, or something beyond either? These questions are no less relevant now than they were in centuries past. Modern psychology confirms that fairy tales offer a safe container, a symbolic terrain in which difficult emotions or experiences can be encountered, explored, and mastered without overwhelming the ego. Each story, no matter how fantastic, is built around the work of becoming, to integrate, to transform, and to bring home a lesson from the forest to the fireside. The tales endure, not because they tell us what to think, but because they ask us to imagine all that we might be. Let the tale continue, low and slow, like the hush of twilight settling over a world both mythic and real. Archetypes, as we've seen, do not cease with the classic 7. Across traditions and centuries, storytellers have embroidered new patterns onto old cloth. The list expands: the everyman, the damsel, the sage, the warrior, the healer, the innocent, the outcast, the creator. Each wears a mask, yet behind each mask we glimpse a face not unlike our own. Fairy tales are not so much about dragons as about the dragon within us, not merely about slippers or apples, but the hopes, terrors, and longings they disguise. In the stories, the familiar becomes strange, the strange suddenly familiar. Consider the everyman, or every woman. A figure so wonderfully ordinary, they throw the weirdness and wonder of the fairy tale world into sharper relief. They are never the cleverest, nor the bravest, but it is precisely their ordinariness that allows us to ride along with the story. Arthur Dent stumbling through the cosmos, John Watson trailing behind Sherlock Holmes, a youngest son or daughter whom fate shapes into a legend. The everyman's journey reassures us. Transformation is possible for anyone, even those who seem the most unremarkable at the outset. Then, the damsel, not always a maiden in distress, but a symbol of innocence, hope, and faith in goodness. Innocence can be both shield and vulnerability. In Alice's wide-eyed curiosity or Tiny Tim's unwavering faith, we see the idea that heartbreak and cruelty need not erase wonder. These characters remind us to keep an ember of hope even as the world grows cold. Their stories do not always end with rescue. Sometimes, innocence is transformed into wisdom, and the once damsel becomes a guide to others. The sage stands on the thresholds of tales, offering guidance rooted in experience. Whether as a hermit, a crone, or the wise old man by the road, the sage's value lies not in imposing solutions, but in illuminating the next step. The world-weary mentor, the gruff yet gentle craftsman, the healer whose advice may be cryptic, all invite the hero, and us, to listen with our inner ear. Their stories teach patience, humility, and the wisdom of seeking counsel, reminders that no path must be walked alone, and no answer is ever final. The warrior is a figure of striving and courage, not always with sword or shield in hand, sometimes armed only with resolve. The warrior stands for the inner battles we must wage, facing fear, enduring sorrow, and protecting what matters most. In fairy tales, the battle may be literal, a giant defeated, a dragon slain, an injustice righted. But more often, the true war is within, as characters struggle with stubbornness, self-doubt, or times when surrender is the hardest victory of all. The healer or herbalist appears less often, but when they do, their gift is restoration and peace. Whether healing a wounded hero or teaching the restorative value of forgiveness, the healer mends more than bodies. They heal communities, families, and hearts. Their knowledge is often hard-won, and their presence a gentle confirmation that, even amid sorrow, brokenness is not the end but a stage on the way to renewal. Innocents and outcasts abound, gentle souls marginalized by circumstance who, through patience or sheer luck, find themselves at the story's fulcrum. Orphans, beggars, scapegoats, and wanderers stand for those aspects of ourselves and our society that are ignored or misunderstood. Their suffering is keen, but the fairy tale assures us that suffering is not meaningless. Even the outcast may find a place in the world, even the forgotten child may receive a crown or a friend. These stories open a path for compassion, urging us to look more kindly on ourselves and others. The creator, artist, inventor, builder, infuses the tale with the spirit of innovation. Sometimes the creator is central, the clever tailor, the girl who spins straw into gold, the one who can solve impossible riddles. Other times, creation is quieter, a wise woman tending her garden, a cobbler stitching shoes for unseen dancers. However the gift appears, it honours the sacredness of making, reminding us that ingenuity and effort can conjure wonders out of even the barest ingredients. Innovation, the tales gently suggest, belongs to those who dare imagine another world and act to shape it. Every one of these archetypes can overlap and transform. The sage may become the warrior when wisdom is put to the test. The damsel may emerge anew as healer or heroine. The fluidity of these forms is what keeps fairy tales alive, able to reflect back who we are and who we are striving to become. As modern storytellers remix and reinvent the old forms, the archetypes remain, a vocabulary for courage, longing, reconciliation, and hope. Thus, as the lantern burns down and the hush grows deeper, the final secret of fairy tales is this. Their hidden messages are not a single code to be broken, nor a riddle with one answer. Rather, each retelling, each listening or reading or sharing, becomes an act of remembering. In these stories we see our strengths and frailties mirrored back. We learn that no journey is wasted, no darkness lasts forever, and the greatest magic is to change, to heal, and to love despite it all. So, wherever you are, in a soft chair, on a quiet walk, listening in the deep night, let the stories linger. Let them remind you that underneath every surface, something wise and wild and wonderful waits. The secret messages are there in every slipper and spindle, every forest path and feather, in longing and loss as much as in wonder and delight. Tonight, as ever, the story awaits you. Listen for its hush beneath the hush. Wander slowly through its secret meanings, and remember, in every end a new beginning is hidden, quietly, softly, like magic, waiting to be found.